It's a figure that defined the EU referendum campaign. They even put it on a bus. It was also a figure that was fiercely disputed. But the promise, vote leave and Britain won't have to pay into the EU anymore. So is that what's going to happen now? The trouble with buses is you tend to have to wait for them. And when Theresa May triggers Article 50, the clock starts ticking on a deal. She needs something quicker, something more sporty. According to the most recent Treasury figures, Britain's gross contribution to the EU, after the rebate is taken into account, is about £14 billion a year. Now, there are some complicating factors that means it can go up or down year on year, but that's roughly how much the UK will no longer be sending to Brussels post-Brexit. But there are other payments that Britain will have to shell out for. First and foremost, the so-called divorce settlement.
It is being said, and openly, by Commissioner Barnier and others in the Commission, that the total financial liability as they see it might be in the order of 40 to 60 billion euros on exit.
The BBC understands the figure EU negotiators are likely to settle on is far lower, around 34 billion euros. But what does the money they're going to argue over actually cover? Well, there's how much Britain owes for stuff in the EU budget is already signed up for until 2020, 1 year after we're expecting to leave. Historically, Britain pays 12% in contributions, so the cost of the UK is likely to be between 10 and 30 billion euros. Then they'll look at the 200 to 250 billion euros of underfunded spending commitments, the so-called RAL. That's another 26 billion euros. Britain could also be liable for around 5 to 7 billion euros for its share of the pensions bill for EU staff. That's again 12% of an overall bill of 50 to 60 billion. Finally, there's our share of the assets held by the EU. They include things like this building, the European Commission headquarters in central London. Britain could argue it deserves a share back of around 18 billion euros from a portfolio that's said to be worth 153 billion euros. So, lots for the two sides to discuss in 2 years of talks.
They have a great opportunity with the Article 50 talks because actually they can hold us to ransom. They can say, you figure out the money, we'll talk about your trade. But until you figured out the money, we won't. So I think many European states think they're in a very strong negotiating position at the moment and they intend to make the most of it.
BBC News at 2 o'clock.
The principle is clear. The days of Britain making vast contributions to the European Union every year will end.
Stirring words, but are they true? Theresa May has already indicated that she would want to sign back up to a number of EU agencies on a programme-by-programme basis. Europol, for example, that's the European Crime Agency, or Erasmus+, which runs student exchanges. If everything stayed the same as it is now, it would cost the UK €675 million a year, based on analysis by the Sunday Politics. But there are likely to be agencies we don't choose to participate in. If we only opted back to those dealing with security, trade, universities and, say, climate change, it could come with a price tag of around €370 million a year. Of course, that's if our European neighbours allow us. I wonder if they're going to let me in. There'll also be a cost to creating a new system to resolve trade disputes with other nations once we're no longer part of the European Court of Justice. Take the EFTA Court, which rules on disputes between the EU and Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein. That costs €4 million to run each year. Though, in the Brexit White Paper published this week, the government said it will not be constrained by precedent when setting up something new. Finally, would the EU get behind the idea of Britain making some contribution for some preferential access to its market?
The sort of thing that Theresa May seems to be hinting at are sectoral arrangements, some kind of partial membership of the customs union. There's no real equivalent to that. Switzerland, which has a far less wide-ranging deal than Norway, pays about 320 million a year for what it gets into the EU budget. But it's not exactly the Swiss deal that we're after, and the EU institutions hate the Swiss deal because it's codified in a huge number of treaties that are messy, complicated and cumbersome, and they really don't want to replicate that with anyone.
Theresa May has been at pains to insist she's in the driving seat when it comes to these negotiations, and that she's prepared for anything.